Thanks, guys. Sorry, Ahli. I'd love to say you weren't expecting it, but.
Hey, no sweat, Ken. Hey, good morning. My name is Ahli Moore, and I am the president and founder of X Factor Solutions. This morning, we are convening a panel of some great people to discuss workplace dialogue and specifically around race. We know that in our very highly politicized current cultural environment, there are a lot of people who struggle with this conversation. And so we're going to do an exercise this morning with everyone, and it's actually going to have a couple of different goals here. One of the things that we're going to attempt to do is actually answer some of these questions around race and some of the questions that you may have had in the workplace. But at the same time, what we're going to do is demo effective ways of communicating with each other, right? We are going to show how you can answer some of these questions without it devolving into a debate or it devolving into an argument. So I'm joined by some great people. We're going to jump right in. We have a limited time this morning. We know that in our current environment, people are hurting, and we know that there are changing rules every day on how we engage with each other. We also know that people often are in conversations where they want to say something, but they just don't know how, or they've said something and it was either returned with frustration or they said it themselves out of frustration, and they wonder, how could I have said this better? When we talk about dialogue, there's a very specific difference between dialogue and debate, or dialogue and a diatribe. Dialogue is a two-way conversation, right? It's not one way. It is an exchange of information, and it's also cooperative in nature. And so when you're in a debate, it's also two-way, but it's not considered cooperative. It's competitive. So what we'll be talking about this morning, what we'll be demoing, is how you can have a two-way conversation, be cooperative, and have an exchange of information to help build relationships rather than trying to get your point across, or rather than trying to prove that you're right in the conversation. I've given you a little bit of background about who I am. I'm also joined this morning by three colleagues of mine. I'd like for them to go ahead and introduce themselves. Kim?
Sure. My name is Dr. Kim Hires. I'm the CEO and founder of the Nightingale firm. I'm a leadership coach, author, and podcast host.
Thanks, Kim. Ken?
So my name is Ken McFarland. I have the pleasure of teaching at Texas A&M University, teaching business students, and also I'm a consultant specializing in CEO coaching and organizational behavior.
All right, and Bill.
Hey everybody, I'm Bill Treasurer. I'm the Chief Encouragement Officer at Giant Leap Consulting. We help people and organizations be and interact more courageously with one another. I'm also an ATD member, and I've spoken to ATD Houston before, so it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to be here. And before we get into it, Ahli, I just want to thank you for pulling this session together. A lot of work goes into organizing something like this. Ahli, you've done a masterful job as always. I always appreciate your professionalism. And I know that pulling together a program like this is particularly challenging and difficult, and that minorities tend to struggle with that. So I wanted to compliment you on that. Wow,
Bill, thank you for your praise. And I know you didn't realize this, but when you said, given that a lot of minorities struggle with this, it's somewhat offensive, because in your attempt to give me a personal accolade, you actually showed a larger bias against minorities, assuming they have an inherent lack of professionalism or organizational skills simply based on race or ethnicity. Your compliment falls into what we would consider to be a microaggression. Instead, you could have simply stated that you were impressed with my professionalism, and in fact, you would have never expected anything less. So for our audience, what we just demoed, and I know Bill isn't microaggressive and Bill is not racist in any way. Bill actually was demoing something that I've heard in the workplace. He was showing us an example of some things that African Americans or people who are not of the majority often hear in the workplace, and that is a microaggression. It's a verbal or nonverbal, intentional or unintentional, and it's sometimes even well-meaning, but they communicate it in either a hostile, derogatory, or in a way that actually uncovers more bias than it does in the assumed compliment. In terms of a dialogue technique that I just used when faced with a microaggression is, instead of assuming that the person has ill intent or ill will in mind, state, I know you didn't realize this, but when you said, and then mention the comment or behavior, it was hurtful because, and then explain why. And then you can also then start to break down why this microaggression exists, what this person's mindset was when they started with it, and then what you can do about it going forward. So Ken, I know that these topics are something that have interested you for quite a while, but as a white man, why do you think it's your responsibility to solve the challenges regarding dialogue and race in the workplace?
So that's a great question, Ahli. I want to key on the word solve, and maybe on the word responsibility as a white man. How can anybody solve a problem for somebody else? Or how can anybody solve a challenge for a group? But if you're a member of an included group, as I am, the goal isn't about solving, it's about being an ally, right? Not a savior, not a solver. And the responsibility for an intractable world condition like this really demands that we have the dignity and the agency to allow people to work together. And we all have a lot of work to do. We're all responsible for the solution. We've all got serious obligations and work that we need to do, be it white, black, male, female, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, multiracial, straight, LGBTQ, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. We've all got serious work to do. And we need to be able to extend that dignity and understanding to each other. And I believe dialogue creates the space for us to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations. We get to share solutions, listen to each other, make the workplace engaging, make the workplace empowering, make the workplace equal. And dialogue gives us that space. It gives us the assumption and this to evaluate our assumptions and our experiences and present them. And so for those of you who are joining us today, Ahli does a great job with dialogue of restating kind of where we're headed and his assumptions. And that's something we always want to do because this is our responsibility. And I want to key in on the concept of allyship, since that is my personal part. And allyship is basically the practice of emphasizing social justice, inclusion, human rights, and protecting those. If you're a member of an included group, you want to advance those for those folks who might be oppressed or marginalized or an excluded group. And allyship says, I'm your ally. It doesn't say I have the solution. It just says I stand with you. And it exposes the fact that, the opposite of racism isn't not being racist, right? The opposite of racism is anti-racism. And my allyship is my responsibility to be active, engaged, and committed. And so thank you for that question, Ahli. But Kim, I've got a question for you. We have all this going on, and we've been talking about all these advancements. And but I kind of don't understand why we still have the diversity initiatives. I mean, I'm colorblind. Shouldn't we just focus on which person could do the job the best?
That's a great question, Ken. Let me put it to you this way. If I'm kidnapped, at a minimum, I need for you to tell the police what I look like, okay? Please see my color, but I honestly hope that my color isn't all that you see. There's a difference between color blindness and multiculturalism. Color blindness only sees my color. It's one of my boxes. I check a lot of boxes, but color blindness says, I don't see any of your boxes. Multiculturalism says, wow, you're a complex human being with unique perspectives that may not align with mine, and that's what makes you fascinating. So for our audience today, you may hear people say color blindness, and what color blindness says is it's okay for me to decide what components of you I'm willing to see. It indirectly says my color is the dominant color, and because you don't match my color, then I don't have to see you. Multiculturalism says we can all be different and coexist. Saying you're colorblind actually means that you start off with a bias. Organizations that engage in multiculturalism ideologies have higher engagement of employees from underrepresented groups because it decreases bias and contributes to a positive diversity climate. So, Bill, hi. I know that some of your clients are white male-dominated organizations, such as construction companies. How do they typically respond to the term white privilege?
Not good. That's the short answer. Yes, I work in many traditionally white male dominated organizations, and a number of them are construction companies. And a lot of these men pride themselves on self-reliance. Before they ever got into a management role, it was because they did a lot of work themselves. And they take this idea of self-reliance and they're proud. They feel like they earned it, that they earned everything that they've got. And when they hear the term white privilege, it insinuates for them mentally some sort of a capitulation, some sort of a surrender, that whatever successes that they've achieved, that it somehow is a result of a gimme, and that it undermines their very identity as being a self-reliant person. It undermines the idea of personal achievement and merit. So it puts up their defenses, this idea of white privilege. To the audience, my suggestion would be that you ease into the conversation. Here's what won't work. And I'll tell you this, Ali and I used to work in a human performance and change management practice at a big company called Accenture. And we learned there that change is resisted when it's done to people, and it's embraced when it's done with people. And if your motive is to get people to think about white privilege and you're going to use a finger in their face to shame them and try to get them to change, it won't work. What will work is if you can have disarming introductory conversations about things that are related to the idea of favoritism. Because who hasn't experienced favoritism? So that's a good starting place. Asking yourself or asking the participants, tell me a time when you have felt like somebody else was being favored. It could have been in their family life. It could have been in an organizational setting. It could have been on a sports team. But when somebody else was being favored, and how did that impact you? What were the consequences of that? Then get them to think, if they were giving a presentation on the dangers of favoritism, what would they include in that presentation? So it becomes a disarming kind of conversation. You ease into the process. Eventually, where you want to get them to, and it wouldn't be in the first conversation. It might be in the third conversation. But then you want to get them to, how might the concept of favoritism relate to race? And let them surface how it connects. Finally, at that point, you can now introduce the idea of white privilege with some research-based examples, so that by now you've disarmed people to open them up to the information. So shaming won't work, a finger in their face won't work, but creating an open dialogue with psychological safety to promote the behavior change that you're trying to get to works much better. So what that makes me think about is Ali speaking about open minds, which I was just speaking to. Why would anyone want to change their organizational culture to fit round pieces into square holes? Shouldn't people just assimilate to the majority and dominant culture?
Bill, that's another great question. Before I answer, I'd like to ask, what company, organization, or individual ever grew by remaining stagnant? I know you talk a lot in your practice, Bill, about taking the right risks. Well, this is a very calculated risk, and it's also necessary to grow your organization, and that is to grow your cultural intelligence. Both innovation and organizational evolution, not revolution, but evolution, require that we purposefully seek growth opportunities. And one of the best ways that we can do that from a talent acquisition perspective is to place just as much emphasis on culture add as we do on culture fit. In other words, instead of always asking if a potential candidate will fit in with our existing organizational culture, we should be asking if the candidate brings unique differences that will add to our culture in our organization. At a minimum, we should be looking to strike a balance in those two questions between culture fit and culture add. Instead of asking a new employee to assimilate, which by the way, never works, we should be asking if his or her unique and perhaps different experiences will help us to see blind spots and opportunities that we otherwise might not have ever seen within our organization. For our audience joining us today, cultural intelligence is defined in part by our capability to cooperate effectively with other people with dissimilar cultural backgrounds, and not just cooperate, but understand them and value them as well. One of the first steps in increasing our cultural quotient, or our CQ, which is tied to our cultural intelligence, is a willingness or open-mindedness that just because our organizational culture works for some doesn't mean that that's the end state. It doesn't mean that it works for everyone within our organization. To effectively grow the organization means to constantly grow our people. And that may mean to move outside of our comfort zones when it comes to what we're used to in our culture. Introducing diversity of experiences, thought, and, other aspects of culture may just be the solution that we need, even if it may initially appear that it isn't a good fit. This concept of culture add stretches us and stretches our organization. So in answering Bill's question, I focused the value that culture may bring to the organization, or that different culture may bring to the organization, instead of placing any value on a particular culture or lamenting about how things are always changing. I focused on the potential benefits. And that's one of the ways that you can address this if someone ever asks you the proverbial question about fitting round pegs into a square hole. So back to you, Ken. You and I, we go back a number of years. We talked a little bit about, some of your experiences in allyship, but I also wanted to know, from your perspective, how can you participate in something when you can't fully understand how it feels to be a member of an excluded community in America? Has anyone ever challenged you based on the fact that you just can't fully understand what it's like?
So another great question, and the short answer is I can't. So I can't fully understand. I can understand concepts of the general human condition. I can understand exclusion. I can understand bigotry. I can understand ignorant hatred, but I have no idea what it's like to live in your skin. I was traveling with someone earlier in the week and was running late and just started speeding, and was reminded of a conversation you and I had that's not an option. In your skin, speeding when you're late is not an option. So there's no way for me to connect with that and fully understand. But what is possible and what is desirable is to try to figure out, how do I live through your experiences and with your experiences? And again, dialogue gives us the ability to connect with that. And yes, I've had people over the years, some have been angered by my presence at events on social justice or activities. And I had a young woman not too long ago at a Black Lives Matter demonstration, tell me that I could never understand because I wasn't Black. And then she said I needed to go away and educate myself until I could fully understand. And I didn't have an immediate response to that, but it just took a second to say, is it more true that there's no way for me to ever understand? Or is it more true that I need to understand? And just posing that question to her, her frown kind of went to a smile, and she said, "Oh, okay, I get it. I can't say that you can never understand, that you have to understand." Now, just that second cracked open a dialogue where I learned a ton, and I feel like she was able to help me better prepare for those circumstances, but also she opened me up again. But that's a struggle that we sometimes run into when being in the included class, being told we've got to understand what we can't understand. So don't let that frustrate us on either side of that, right? Audience, the continuous education, self-awareness, reflection, my own personal bias inquiry, that's our work. And we do that regardless of our ethnic background or our genders. It's, understanding is our currency. right? That's what we have to exchange. But understanding can't be a place we get to. It has to be a process and a path. And it's a path that takes us from fear and defensiveness, and hopefully, guides us to effectiveness and equality. And speaking about equality, Kim, one of the difficulties I have is we invest all this money in minority recruitment, and we make them feel welcome, and we do all this, but within a few years they just leave. So how am I supposed to champion diversity if they don't stay?
Good question, Ken. So there's this phenomenon that happens when we get recruited. Everyone is so excited. We're treated like unicorns. We are protected. We are shown off. Our faces get used for diversity campaigns. Companies go, look, see, we are diversity. And then we start to unleash our magic and it becomes a problem. We may even dare to introduce too much change at once. People start to feel threatened. Our credibility gets questioned. Suddenly, our word isn't good enough. Eventually, the environment becomes hostile and the discrimination becomes more overt. And it becomes painful to come to work every day, to be perfectly honest with you. And then there's only but so much that we can take. Most of my clients are highly successful Black women who experience burnout due to this very thing. So to the audience, if this felt familiar, if what I described felt familiar to anyone, it's because it's a real phenomenon. It's called pet to threat. It describes the transition in how we are perceived from recruitment to eventually resignation. Recruitment is usually a great fanfare with all the bells and whistles, but the problem is the organizational culture is not fully primed to welcome and continuously support diversity. And eventually the environment becomes hostile and we leave. And that ultimately impacts retention. So the responsibility of reducing the threat does not fall on the employee. It falls on the individuals who feel threatened. They have to go inward and explore why they feel threatened by the individual. It's an internal conflict that manifests outward. So that dialogue needs to happen internally. So Bill, you were recently on my podcast, the Leadership Antidote podcast. You talked about your personal evolution regarding racism. It would be good for you to share that with today's attendees so they can reflect on their own evolution.
I'm happy to do so. And let me just suggest to our listeners to download Dr. Kim's podcast, The Leadership Antidote. It's terrific. It's got a lot of great advice and counsel and wisdom. And as I shared with Dr. Kim on the podcast that I did with her, my own journey has been one that I continue to be on it. The journey doesn't end. You don't graduate from it, but it's been a learning journey for me. And I wonder if it's like that for many of you. My own journey is that I grew up around racism. People that I love deeply and very ethical, well-intentioned people were racist and said hurtful and racist things. I have heard the N-word. And I am embarrassed to say I have used the N-word because I heard the N-word. This is me growing up 18 miles from Manhattan. I grew up in a suburb called Westchester, New York. And so I was around it, and it was the way of interacting, the way of being. It wasn't all the time, but I heard these things and then started saying them as an outcome of them myself. And then I had an unusual experience. I fell in love with a girl whose family was multiracial. Her mom had gotten divorced from her father, and her mom had remarried an African American. So now it was a blended family. And I went and I lived with them as I fell in love with this girl, and lived with them for 3 years, and was in the household where we were celebrating birthdays together and going to confirmation together and cheering on the Green Bay Packers together and having arguments together and breaking bread together. And it wasn't about white and black. It was about good people that I was developing relationships with. Think of how that impacted me as a guy who grew up sort of around banal racism and what it did to me to be able to sort of cleanse me of that. Now, I'm still on a journey. One doesn't graduate, but I can tell you this. I'm very proud of the fact that my 3 teenagers have never heard me or my wife ever use the N-word in our house ever, and they never will, because I know that the damage that that can do, and because I have been around good people that it would be an insult to their memory to be able to carry that forward. My question to you, audience members, what's your personal experience with racism? Think back as far as your grandparents. When's the first time you heard a racist thing, and how did it strike you? When's the last time you heard a racist thing, and what did you do about it? Did you confront it, or did you let it pass? What's your own relationship with racism? We use this term racism writ large, but it's much better if we narrow it down to our own individual experience and consider it, and consider our own evolution. Have we evolved from, say, the person we were 25 or 30 years ago? And my hope would be that you could answer affirmatively, but how will you then carry that forward, what you've gotten enlightened with? How will you make a better mark in the world to diminish racism based on your own evolution? So, but thank you, Dr. Kim, for asking the question.
Thank you to our panelists. So I realized while we were on the screen that we may not have been showing our presentation this entire time, but no worries. It was re-emphasizing some of the words that our panelists were already saying. But we do have some quick tips around dialogue. So we talked about how to address dialogue for some very specific questions around race and race in the workplace and race in general. And the participants in today's session should have a handout that talks about some of that. But as it relates to the do's and don'ts of dialogue, when to dialogue is very important. We dialogue when we don't know the answer or need to get outside of our own understanding, our own personal box. We dialogue when we haven't had the benefit of a diverse perspective. And we dialogue when we are in conflict and when we're light on trust. But we don't use these techniques. We don't necessarily need to try to have dialogue when the room is on fire, when we need an immediate answer to something, because the purpose of dialogue isn't to convince, it's to exchange ideas. And when we need to do problem solving, we need to have done dialogue first before we get into the problem solving. And also dialogue isn't necessarily, relevant when we all already know the answer. And so those are some do's and don'ts around when to dialogue, when not to dialogue. Another little bit of information I want to share with you, how to dialogue and ways to know that you did it right. So hopefully through the Q&A that I had with our fellow panelists, we showed that you have to suspend some of your personal assumptions. You have to balance your need for advocacy with inquiry. I would lean more on inquiry, seeking first to understand, then to be understood. We ask clarifying questions. If you noticed, even in the questions that were somewhat controversial, they were asking a question and then the response was both in clarifying, but also perhaps asking them, how did they come to that conclusion? Listen without reloading. So listen to what is being said without thinking of your next answer before fully engaging in active listening. Be respectful by not interrupting or talking over the others. As I said before, seek first to understand, second to be understood, from Stephen Covey. Share the air, invite others into the dialogue, and avoid this concept of us versus them thinking, right? It is not, as I said at the beginning, a competition. It is two or more people together trying to come to some mutual understanding. Ways to know you did it right. The dialogue session was respectful and non-judgmental. Everyone felt free to speak on his or her truth. New perspectives were shared and understood, and new thought was generated. The whole concept here is that we enter into these conversations in an attempt to share information and to exchange ideas, okay? So now we have exactly 15 minutes left in this session. Bill, Kim, and Ken and I hopefully demonstrated some effective dialogue techniques. We'd like to open it up to the audience now. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, but I want to do it a little differently than what you may be used to. We do have experts on this panel and they can answer your questions. But if you have questions either about racial topics, but more specifically about how to dialogue around those racial topics, feel free to ask that question. But instead of just having one of the panelists answer that question, I'd like for either the panelists or audience members, if you're courageous and brave enough, to speak to the answer to that question as well. What workplace dialogue technique might you use or might be most appropriate to address the question that's being asked? So I know we have the help of a producer on this session who can actually see questions, etc. But anyone speak up.
Is it okay to just speak?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Carol Anna King, and I lead learning and talent development for a large manufacturing organization. We're just forming our DE&I council. And I really liked what you were talking about, Kim. You're preaching to the choir. I think having the culture that supports this is so critical. We have a consultant who's working with us. She called it the black tax. She said, a lot of times people of color get asked to lead these councils and be the ones driving the charge. And that's really not the right way, in my opinion, to approach this. So we have a council, and we're 80% white male in leadership, and we want them to be allies. But my question to you is, knowing that we're just starting this journey, we do have a very diverse workforce on the front lines, and we do have some things in place. So I don't mean to imply we have nothing. But what are the top 2 or 3 things, and maybe I missed it in the presentation, I was trying to listen intently, but what 2 or 3 things would you say we could do right now that would help start to jumpstart that culture for us, so that we're not, getting out over our skis in the council without having a process to back it up?
Well, the first step, I'm going to put my coach's hat on for a second. The first step is self-awareness. Are you ready to be an ally? How do you feel about all of this change? Because fundamentally, that's what this is. Mm-hmm. This is change, right? And so the human brain interprets change as a threat within an 1/8 of a second. So if we look at,
I didn't know that statistic.
That's how if you see a snake out of the corner of your eye, to flinch before you fully process that it's a snake.
Wow.
It's a survival mechanism. So with all of the change that's happening, I would say first and foremost, start with self-awareness. You've got to go deep. It's wonderful to have men and different allies on the council, but make sure that they are there to really drive this change forward. Because we often start off with the best of intentions. So maybe even, doing some coaching work, having some open conversations like what Bill had. How did you grow up? How did you grow up perceiving diversity? How comfortable are you with this change? Because when people feel threatened, the defenses are going to go up. They're going to try to return to what they know. And that's when you get the hostile environment. So that would be step 1. Start off with some self-awareness work.
We are doing that. We have some unconscious bias and just training with a consultant for the team. But it's great to develop that team, but what are we going to do that's evident to others that shows that this is a real commitment, and acknowledging that we have a lot of work to do, but starting to take actionable steps so they don't feel like it's just a lot of talk?
Yes. Have you asked your current employees, what do they want to see?
We have a little bit, but I think that's a great point. We need to do more of that. And I don't mean to turn this into a personal Carol coaching session, but I just find this has been very, very helpful and fascinating. So
thanks.
Good point there.
Before we go into the next question, Carol, I'd like to add to something that Kim said. So we often, in my practice, I get people who ask, should we do unconscious bias training? Should we do X, Y, Z? And I say the very first thing is your leadership commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then the assessments and the self-awareness. Before we even stood up the diversity council in one of my clients, we had 4 months of assessments and self-discovery, and then we stood up the diversity council as a product of the work that we had done up to that point. Yes. But thanks, great question.
given that no one knows what we're doing as a diversity council, I think we'll take that as an opportunity to go gather some data and do some assessment. I think that that's a very, very valuable piece of this, and I appreciate you all answering the question.
Absolutely.
Next question, whether it's about diversity or the dialogue techniques in answering questions about diversity.
Ali, we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Can you go ahead and read?
Would you like me to read you? Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
So from Bonnie Moore, how do you have a conversation around discrimination, race, gender, etc., with colleagues who don't see there are concerns or don't believe there is a problem?
Okay.
Bill hit the nail on the head with that.
Bill, do you want to take that? I can chime in as well.
Oh, look at the time. We've got, first of all, it's a reality, right? And it's a reality today. I had somebody very close to me recently told me that they thought that racism is a fraud. So how much impact am I going to have conversing with that person? Their mind is so fossilized that it would be unusual if they would suddenly have an enlightenment from my conversing with them. That said, I think that to try to have a conversation around what do they, if you can personalize it, maybe not with that dramatic example that I just gave you of somebody who thinks that racism is a fraud. That I would let that one go. You're not going to be able to help that person ingest any additional information that will cause them to think otherwise. But if you have somebody who just doesn't, who's never been introduced to it before, then conversations around what's the world that they want to leave their kids? What are the values that they have that they say that they hold dear and that matter to them? Like fairness will probably come up when they say that. Then ask them, what's their vision of fairness? What situations look unfair to them? And then you sort of can move into the idea that that there are certain races that have experiences that are not so fair compared to the rest of us. When I walk into Walmart, I'm not going to be watched, particularly if I'm dressed like I am today. And nobody's going to watch me to make sure I'm not going to be pilfering something from the store shelves. But that's not the same experience that every Black American experiences. So introducing it at that personal level, coming at it a little bit sideways, talk about fairness, talk about values, things that they say they want to uphold, and then enters into the conversation about situations that are unfair that they may not be privy to themselves based on their own sort of narrow frame of reference.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Bill, also when we talk about bias, whether it be unconscious bias or whether it be overt bias, so typically we find that there are 12, most prevalent biases in the workplace, but there are more than 250 that have been documented. And when we start to explain or help people understand that we all have biases, whether it be ageism, whether it be gender bias, whether it be beauty bias, and they can start to see little things that they've done in their own career that have been biased in nature, or ways that they have benefited from those things, where tall men are given the benefit of the doubt of being, the leader in the room as compared to short people, or people who have certain facial features that we consider to be beautiful are also considered to be more social in nature when there's actually no connection there. Once we help people understand how many biases there are, that will also help the light bulb to go off for them. Because I completely agree with you, Bill. We can work all we can with other people, but ultimately it's up to them whether they're willing to embrace the understanding of these concepts. Because I often get asked by people, how do I make someone think this way? Or how do I make someone understand this? And I said, well, you can't. You can offer your experiences, you can offer your insight, and you can offer to have a conversation with them. At the end of the day, they have to be willing to accept that information and change it for themselves.
Yeah, and to add to that, Ali, I'm left-handed. I've heard things said about left-handed people, but on the plus column and the negative column. I've got a relative who's like, you're so offbeat, Bill, and it's because you're left-handed. It really attributes to that. On the other hand, other people will tell me I'm creative because I'm left-handed. I don't know, but I'm just left-handed. I didn't choose to be which hand that I have. On the other hand, I heard somebody once have a conversation around, help me understand the idea of unconscious bias. And they said, well, what color is a Band-Aid? And the person said skin color. And then the other person said, well, whose skin? And then they were, oh, okay. And they right instantly, with a very small example, saw how unconscious bias happens sometimes with white people on small little things like that.
Yeah, great. So
Now,
we have 5 minutes left.
Ali,
and-
I'd like to
Yeah.
30 seconds on that as well.
Yeah,
So again,
real quick, Ken, let me just make a time check with everybody because when we hit the 11:45 mark, it completely shuts off. So go.
30 seconds. Definitely, as you guys were chatting about those who want to argue versus those who want to be aware, I find one thing that's helpful for me when I'm speaking with somebody who's in the included group is I just say, how many times a week is your skin color made conscious to you? How many times a day do you think about your skin color? How many times a week do you change your behavior based on skin color? And I find that just the realization that it's almost never, if you're a male and you're white, tends to be able to open that conversation to move them to awareness.
Great, thanks, Ken. Next question. Let's see if we can squeeze in at least 2 more questions before we wrap up.
Okay, this one's from Rachel Harner. Dr. Hires, can you give examples of what you meant when you talked about how things change after the initial onboarding? What does that look like from your view? My guess is that white employees are oblivious to what's happening and may not intend the outcome.
Right. So it can start with exclusionary behavior. So all of a sudden, you're the last to know things. You might get cut out of emails. There begins to be questioning of your work and micromanaging starts. The microaggression begins to get a little bit more frequent. Comments about why you're there, what made you come here. Suddenly your presence just gets questioned. And eventually it gets uncomfortable coming to work. So if you find that, you're making sly comments or just sort of saying things that you perhaps shouldn't be saying, or you're questioning the person a lot more, or you're going behind them and double checking what they're doing. Those are just some of the examples of what groups tend to do when they want to mitigate a threat in the workplace. And just from my experience and what I hear from my clients, and there is research done on this, it becomes a matter of the environment becomes very unwelcoming. Suddenly you're talked over in meetings. You're not invited to meetings. You're not able to make decisions. And it just keeps building and building and building until the employee can't take it anymore.
Thanks, Kim. So we're only a couple of minutes out. I'd like to offer the opportunity for our panelists to say any closing remarks. From me, first of all, to our panelists, thank you. And to the participants, our audience that joined us today, thank you. Feel free to follow up with me or any of our panelists. We'd all be more than welcome to answer your questions, have other conversations with you, tell you more about what our individual practices do. But Kim, any last words before we wrap up?
No, just thank you for the opportunity. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'm on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, Dr. Kim Hires. I'd love to continue this dialogue, and please don't be shy. Feel free to reach out.
All right, from Dr. Kim to Dr. Ken.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for having us, but also thanks for the journey you're on, and just don't stop. It's a journey that we have throughout our lives. So thank you for being active and engaged. Now get more engaged and more active. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ken. And Bill?
Well, first of all, thank you to all the panelists. How great to be able to share this time with you in this unique way. Thank you to ATD and our ATD community and your desire to have this particular panel. It shows a lot about you. To the folks that are patching in, my great hope is that you'll put your voice and your own influence, your own leadership behind this topic. It's so very, very important in America, especially today in this moment. Know where you stand and then lend your voice to it. And then to my buddy, Ali, thanks so much for inviting me.
Hey, my pleasure. Hey, 4 panelists, 8 panel questions, and 4 or 5 audience questions, all within 45 minutes. I think this was a success. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the conference.